G'day legends, I hope that you are having a fantastic day. Now last week I did an interview with Mr. RealReporter on a video called How Europe and Ukraine Plan to Take on Russia Without the US. Now, Mr. RealReporter, he put up this video and used parts of my interview with himself to get across the message of the video and to add maybe some more balanced perspective. Now I've actually asked as well, due to this interview being cut up, do I have your permission to then just post the whole interview? There's some mistakes and some dropping in and out of coverage as well. But I think the way I interview is I just do the full interview and then don't edit it, just straight up as people see. But I think as a way too to protect maybe myself in the future too, is if I do an interview where it's going to be cut up for the media or for the news or whoever, irregardless of if I trust them or not, if that doesn't matter, is then to actually post the full conversation somewhere of what was actually said as well. Because of course things can be cut up. I think he's done a fantastic job of the video and I implore you to go and watch that. But this is just going to be just the entirety of our conversation and mistakes that with the Zoom call as well. So legends, I hope that you enjoy it and thank you for the opportunity to speak on your show.
All right, ready?
Good to go.
All right. Hey, well, first of all, thank you so much for joining me for this show. I really appreciate it. I've been following your channel for quite a while now, and it's a great pleasure to finally talk online.
Oh, mate, thank you. I'm glad we were able to put it together at very short notice. But it fits in well because, of course, I start chemotherapy on Monday, so we've sort of had to pack it in. But I'm glad we can both work out a time.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So. You know, I want to start with the most recent news at the time of our recording, because there's just a lot to unpack. At the UN, for the first time since the war in Ukraine began, the US sided with Russia and China by approving a resolution that didn't condemn Russia, but instead called for peace. Meanwhile, in Washington, on the same day, during a meeting with Emmanuel Macron, Donald Trump refused to call Vladimir Putin a dictator when pressed by a reporter and suggested the war might end in the coming weeks. Now, over in Russia, Putin held a somewhat surprise late-night cabinet meeting to discuss the development of the country's rare earth minerals, and he claimed Russia has more of these resources than Ukraine. And he also suggested Zelensky is becoming politically toxic and doesn't want elections because he'd lose to former commander-in-chief Zaluzhny, and even echoed Trump's recent remark that slashing U.S. and Russian military spending by 50% might not be a bad idea. So, I mean, all of this happened in just one day. So let me ask you this. Do you get the sense that a deal has already been made between Russia and the U.S. regarding Ukraine? And if so, what do you think that deal might look like?
Look, let me first say in that there's so much to unpack in that, and there's, you know, videos we could make that'd be a 30-minute explanation of each one of those points. But I guess to focus on the question of, has a deal already been made? Look, I don't think a deal has been made. I think there will be bare bones of a deal sitting there. But as far as what that may look like, I've spoken about this a lot, is if you want the war to end here and now, there is going to have to be concessions. And I think everyone who is realistically looking to an end to the war, they have realised there's going to have to be some concession made to end the war. And I believe at this point in time, to, you know, quote Donald Trump, is that at this point in time, Putin does hold the cards. He does have more cards on the table. Does Ukraine have cards on the table? Yes, they do. You know, they're not there all in with nothing on their side. They do have, but who has the majority of cards? Well, it is Russia at this point in time. And the US, they are seriously looking for an end to the war. And I've explained to a lot of people and to a lot of people who disagree, but I think who disagree more on an idealistic point more than a realistic point, that Trump's calculus, he's looking at this not for what is best for the territorial integrity or sovereignty of Ukraine. He's looking at this for, realistically, how do we end the war this week? And secondly, and maybe even more so than that, is how do we pull Russia away from China's growing hegemony, dominance in the world? And I believe that is where we need to look through a bit of this lens. Is Trump betraying Ukraine? I think we need to look at it as far as why are these decisions being made? We can't look surface level with Trump. He's got a lot of advisors. He says shit publicly, whatever, but behind the scenes, it's a duck on the water. He's the head out the top making statements, but the legs are going under the water at a million miles an hour. And I believe there's a lot more in this decision, and a lot more to try and build a relationship there again with Russia due to the complications and competition that Russia's move, which is at my point at this standing right now, almost looks like we've crossed an event horizon between Russia and China's relationship. But I guess we will see. But as far as trying to draw that back into somewhat of an orbit as well.
Oh, that's interesting. Hey, you mentioned that. You mentioned that there are cards at the table for Russia and Ukraine. What are the What are cards for Ukraine? What do they still have? What they can play with?
Well, the biggest cards for Ukraine is, of course, using the Western economies. That most of the Western economies, I'll say most of them, are on Ukraine's side, have signed even deals for many, many years. Now, of course, there are issues in this because you're dealing with democratic countries who it doesn't really matter if they sign a 100-year deal, a 50-year deal. There can be a turnover of policies, really at the maximum of 5 years, depending on the country. And of course, that can change. But as far as Ukraine having an economic collapse, so to speak, that has already occurred. Ukraine, the economy is in default, but that is then backed by all but, at this point in time, looking like all but the US economy. And of course, there is a lot of funding there. There's a lot of weapons there. And there's a lot of depth in this, and still able to maneuver economically around the world. Now, do I think that fills the main problem that Ukraine has? No. I said this in my video that went live, I believe, 7 minutes ago. I said the EU is going to come to a point where they realize it doesn't matter if we have trillion-dollar GDPs. They're going to get the point of realization that the problem Ukraine has isn't the economic funding by the EU. It isn't the amount of weapons we can give. It is a shortage of manpower. Now, I don't know how that realization hasn't become yet in Europe, but it is going to be a very difficult one. But as far as cards on the table, as far as the ability for economic sanctions, which of course, have had a lot less use than we had thought, at least to influence the Russian economy. But there still is things against shadow fleets. There's, of course, the 300 billion if the Europeans are brave enough to touch that, because of course that can have huge effects for the stability and the security of the euro moving into the future. I think that could cause a lot of problems. But of course, what Ukraine has, the biggest card Ukraine has on the table is the informational war. That is the biggest card on the table. Is at this point in time, the majority of the Western world and their analysts and their politicians, and I say the majority. Now, the US, who is, of course, the dominant country in this, is slid another way at this point in time. But they are vehemently on Ukraine's side, to speak in layman's terms. And that is a big card on the table. Now, a lot of people may go, the biggest card on the table is Kursk. No, it is not. Kursk is a card on the table, and that is a card on the table that will get wiped out with, a swap back of land in Kharkiv. It's 50% or less than the amount of occupied ground in Kharkiv at this point in time. So that's not the card people think it is. The informational aspect of the war, that is the biggest card that Ukraine has on the table at this point in time, and can escalate and de-escalate due to that also.
Yeah, interesting. Well, you mentioned Kursk, but I think that the perception that has been is that yes, the size of the territory seized from Russia is maybe relatively small, but it's like Russia's mainland, and it's a sore in the eye in the side of Russia, and that it's also could be a bargaining chip for Ukraine to exchange this territory for something else. I don't know if this is true. It's just, this is what the
Look,
perception goes.
I'm not denying that it's a bargaining chip. I just think the size of that chip, the wealth of that chip on the table, I think is greatly overestimated by everyone. Let's look at the wealth of the chip by kilometre squares. Okay, let's say at this point in time, by deep state map, I believe, correct me if I'm incorrect, but it's about 440 kilometre squares, around about that. Okay. Let's say at this point in time, due to it being, embarrassing for Russia and it is mainland of the Russian Federation that is being occupied by a foreign state, or however you want to call it, let's even say it is a 10 to 1 kilometre square swap. So Russia is getting, will trade back 4,500 square kilometres for it. In the grand scheme of the 111 to 115,000 square kilometres that are currently occupied by the Russian forces within Ukraine, I still say, as far as relevance on the battlefield, relevance strategically, not tactically, it's not that it's nothing, but it's not made out like people think that it is. That the Donbass is not going to be swapped for Kursk. That's not going to happen. I think realistically, it's looking like Kharkiv is 2 to 2.5 times the amount of ground Russians have in there than Ukraine holding Kursk. And I think Trump, if he's facilitating this, will go, look, that is a fair exchange. Kursk, we can get stuck into it, but it's a tactical victory, a strategic loss. And I think Ukraine, given the opportunity to have a withdrawal fairly out of Kursk for some exchange, I think that strategically the command will take that at some point.
Yeah. Speaking of the battlefield, there are several hotspots in the Russia-Ukraine conflict right now, and including the Kursk region that you just mentioned. But also there is the Pokrovsk direction where both sides have amassed significant assault forces. In your opinion, what is the most critical point on the war map at the moment? Like where might we see surprises or rapid developments?
Look, it's difficult because kilometre squares is the barometer that we've got to measure success on the battlefield, and a little bit like measuring someone's wealth, it's not the best measurement of their character, and measurement of kilometre squares is not the best way to get a measurement of success or failures on the battlefield, because some areas 10 square kilometres is less than a kilometre squares, and I believe that the higher echelon of Russian command would rather gain 2 kilometre squares in the direction of Chasiv Yar than they would in the direction of Pokrovsk. As far as the high ground, the road network down into areas like Toretsk, the road network into Kramatorsk. But the two areas of which what I'll say is everyone's familiar with these areas, areas out of Velyka Novosilka, Pokrovsk, Chasiv Yar. The two areas which I'm most saying to keep an eye on because it could develop very quickly is right up in the northeast. We have seen that Russia has then created a bridgehead across the obstacle of the waterway that runs in there. And that tells us a lot about crossing an obstacle from a former infantry background, mechanized infantry. I did multiple years doing this. Now, of course, not on a battlefield like this, but I understand the difficulty in crossing an obstacle like a waterway, especially mechanized infantry. Incredibly difficult. Now, Russia took a big gamble in the northeast to be able to cross that. And what that tells me is it wasn't Russia's success in being able to do that, is that should have been fairly easily countered by minimal reserves, because you've got a force crossing an obstacle. You should be able to see Ukraine hold the high ground in there. There should have been a very easy, relatively easy, but speaking of an attritional war, to mobilize the amount of resources needed to have them fail at that cross. And we've seen them cross there and expand. And that is of great concern to me, given that has not only crossed successfully, but now is expanding and expanding to the point where it's going to be difficult to push back. And to keep an eye on areas where we see weapons used that we may not see that much, especially down crossing the Dnipro towards Odessa into deeper Kherson. Keep an eye out for that. There's little bits I say about information that I say Ukraine can't afford to have happen, as much as crossing into Zaporizhia Oblast, or expanding on the right bank of the Dnipro, or expanding further down the border in Kharkiv. You need to look at it as an informational aspect too, because if Russia hold 1 square kilometre on the right bank of Kherson and it goes to meetings with Trump, who's looking to end this war, then they may have a leg to stand on and go, well, we want more. So as far as the measurement of kilometer squares and the hotness can have more of a tactical compared to a strategic advantage on different areas of the front.
Interesting. Let's imagine Ukraine is cut off from American support starting tomorrow. How long could it sustain the fight against Russia? And Ukrainian officials claim to have amassed around 40 billion in gold reserves and a robust domestic drone industry, which has become a key weapon in this war. What's your take on that?
See, it depends what people classify as cut off from US aid.
Hmm.
Now, let's give a couple of aspects in this. I think when most people think US aid, they're thinking America's not sending more Bradleys, they're not sending more Abrams. They are not the elements of this war that I'd be concerned about if I were Ukraine. Number one would be Starlink. That would be number one. Ukraine may have amassed hundreds of thousands into the millions of drones. I don't deny that. But at the end of the day, a lot of those are very reliant, if not solely reliant, on Starlink. So that is a huge problem, as well as communications at the front line. What we have seen in this battlefield is, because America and some Western states won't want to hand over some encrypted radio network, at least some of it, what may be operated at a high classification level for the crypto and whatever within it, that Ukraine is very reliant on things like WhatsApp, Telegram, Signal, and other encrypted chats like this. And not only if Starlink were cut, would the drones, instantly not be flying, at least en masse, there'd be a huge cut, maybe 50%, maybe 90%. But also all the communications would then really plummet due to Starlink and guys just not having coverage. And then they would maybe fall back on something like Kyivstar, 4G network, 3G network, what are far, far easier for Russian all-land drones to pick up where those are pinging. They basically fly, and I've had a breakdown with the guy specifically on this. Basically flying an all-land drone with an antenna that will ping off Ukrainian SIMs, so they can pick up clusters of soldiers at areas. So that's why these more encrypted areas and turning off mobile phones to the front line is very important. So it's not the weapons or the bullets that I'd be concerned about. It is Starlink connectivity for then communications and drones. The second one would be, how hard does America want to push? People don't have this. America can push many countries into a corner. I think people underestimate the power of America because we have not seen for decades America truly push on an allied country. Who owns the GPS network? It is America. America can do things around the GPS to spoof it, to do whatever. And that was occurring when I was in Israel. Now, I don't know exactly how this works. The way to do it, I would say, would be very, very highly classified. But GPS can, of course, be hindered. Now, Ukraine may have a fallback onto the Russian GLONASS system, which I would say a lot of their systems are already operating GLONASS because Russia will not be prepared to have spoofing of that system due to their own systems operating. And then third, I guess, on that, is their ISR capability. The country with the largest network, well, potentially the largest network, we're not exactly sure on China's, but let's say the largest network involved in this conflict right now is America, as far as intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance. Everything from drones flying the Black Sea to satellite imagery to all sorts of different sorts of intelligence as far as where they've tracked certain movements for decades.
Oh, hey, can you hear me? Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah, I've got you.
Oh, it's yeah, it's just it felt like it broke up.
Oh, you're right. Have you got me now?
Yeah, yeah. Hold on. Let me check just if we're still recording this because
Yeah, all
that
good.
would
It
be.
says recording my end.
Oh yeah. Uh-huh, uh-huh. Cool, cool. Let me just double check this because I'm just testing this new studio setup and I'm just
No, all
trying
good.
to
All
get a
good.
hold of things. Uh, all right. Oh yeah, yeah. No, no, we're good.
All good.
Yeah.
So I'll kick off. Are you right for me to kick off where I left off?
Yeah, yeah. Please.
Yeah. Yeah, so my concern isn't as much on the hardware as it is, I guess, we'll call the soft powers of Starlink, GPS, ISR, all of that. That's where my or more of my concern would be. I think Europe and other states can backfill a lot of that, like South Korea getting involved, Australia, Japan. As far as hardware, but I actually explained on my video yesterday that even Australia, who is arguably America's closest ally, given, maybe Canada, maybe us, but of course we're very close allies, even equipment I used when I was in the forces, Australians did not have permission to have some of the use case of that. So instantly, if
Interesting.
America wanted to lean on Australia, instantly the a system within my vehicle without Americans would not work. When it went down and something happened or I needed something updated or whatever, and I was a commander in the vehicle, I would have to approach American contractors who would have had very high clearances. Australians do not own that system. We, in turn, I guess, rent that system or have an exchange of that system. We'll give a bit of technology. Australia's got very, very high-end, world leading in radio systems and radars. So we will give something like that to the Americans, and then they will give us permission to use a system. But a lot of these systems we do not truly own. And I spoke about this as even a problem into countries like Germany or France. These are not completely self-sufficient states militarily. America can lean on some of this equipment, and that's the problem. Is it seems to me it is how much does America want to throw its weight around?
Yeah, yeah,
And no
that's
one's seen America throw its weight in decades. Truly throw its weight against an ally. There may be little pushes here and there, and look at the tariffs. America threw its weight for 24 hours and people buckled.
yeah. By the way, speaking of this, America's push, let me ask you this. Uh, where do you stand on this debate over whether Zelensky should hold an election in Ukraine? Like, it seems to have become a major issue for both Putin and Trump.
Mm.
Uh, how do you make
Look,
of this?
it is the election paradox. This is very, very a difficult question because under the Ukrainian constitution, there is legal framework for Zelensky not to have to hold elections. Now, I think an update today, which is very large in the Ukrainian Rada within the parliament, he did not get as far as the votes for. He needed 228 or 232 votes, and he got like 206 for at least showing support from the parliament to the presidency. Now, that is mostly just optics, but it does show the parliament may have some swinging ideas too. Now, you have special powers in military times because an authoritarian state with, say, under martial law is more efficient militarily. Zelensky can make decisions which, if he was the president at the time through just an elected process, would have to go through the parliament, would have to go through governments. It's not as vertical, it's not as efficient. And this is why martial law exists at wartime. But of course, what we hear, the rhetoric from the Western states, is we are upholding democracy in Ukraine. And what I say is that's all well and good rhetoric. But at this point in time, Ukraine is not democratic at this point. If they would hold election, then yes. And what I say is martial law puts a pause button on the democratic process for a period of war. Now, this has become, of course, a massive sticking point for Putin. That is very obvious why. I think a lot of people think Putin has the advantage in Ukraine holding an election. I don't think that's the only place where an advantage has. I think there's a major advantage in being able then to actually draw out that time and some of the other leverages Russia may have, because they may say, oh, well, look, this area is occupied. Some of these people have foregone Ukrainian citizenship or Russian citizenship and be able to draw that time out. And at this point in time, with the country hanging in limbo for more military decisions, the longer Putin can drag out a process like this, the more messy it can be done. Of course, the more beneficial that may be for the conflict, at least for his side. It's become, of course, a huge sticking point for Trump because I believe in the phone calls between Putin and Trump that Putin has said to Donald Trump that we are not willing to engage in any of this with you unless a democratic process takes place in that state. And Trump, who tends to be very popular because he speaks like one of the boys at the pub, He has gone, well, look, what we're saying is that we want to uphold democracy. You have not had an election. Therefore, you need to have an election. That needs to take place because if America want to uphold, as they say, the freedoms of democracy, the voters' rights, all of this, and then we are supporting a country that has refused to do this, even if there is legal framework in place, I think Trump sees that it's a little bit backwards. So this is the problem with it, though, is it greatly benefits one side of the equation, being the Russian forces at this point, greatly inhibits Ukraine. And of course, then Trump's pushing on that. If Trump wants to happen, again, what I say is I don't think people understand. I think they underestimate the power America can push on these other states to force an election. Unless Zelensky goes, no, we're just not doing it. And then I guess we will see. But there is fear about the way that election would go. And how does that election take place? And I've given my own ideas for years of how, if I was America, how I would want this. And how I think in wartime it should be under martial law. And what I have said is Ukraine's concern, or one of the concerns, I guess, away from, putting in a government that may be more likely to stop the war, is how do you get everyone to vote? There's people behind the front line. There's people in Europe. There's people on the front line. How do you get this to vote? And what I look back at is and I can't remember his name at the time, but he has a book called War is a Racket. And basically what he says is that at a point of war, when martial law is enacted, the ones who should be able to vote are the ones who can be conscripted. So, if you're taking away the rights of some of the population, well, you take away rights of the population. That is what martial law is doing. So you have said 18 to 60 cannot leave the country. 18 to 60 can be mobilized. What he then claims, what he says to do is, well, then what you say is, well, then if you're not in that, if you've got the ability to move, the ability for safety, you're not going to be ripped off the street and put to the front line, you then don't have a say in where the country goes for this period of time. And it would be done as a limited plebiscite. Now, of course, the actual way to do this, of course, I'm not giving a logistical way to actually be able to participate in this, but I think it would be able to be done over a period of time, is that those who have volunteered, men, women, old, young, whoever has volunteered to fight, who has shown willingness to go and sign up and go, I am going to fight for this, or those who could be conscripted. So if you're an 18-year-old man, you at this point have the ability to vote in a limited, I believe it would be a plebiscite at that point in time, for where this future goes, whether that is for the leader of the country or whether it is for decisions made. But I believe at a time like this, that is more fair than if the US push and say elections need to be held, that giving a bloke at the front line who has fought for 3 years, who has volunteered to fight, the same voting rights, although he couldn't leave the country, as someone who has left into Europe for the past 3 years and has been working somewhere else and hanging around. War is a time where rights get reduced, and that is, not good if you're a male. But I think, too, we need to look at this and go, well, sometimes that this is upheld. Now, I don't know if Trump would go for this, but I believe it's a very interesting way to look at maybe an easier way to do this that gives a more broad stroke of how people who are actually involved in the war are feeling, not someone with the same, who has not had the same commitment, who fled on day one or has been living somewhere not at the front line. Now, I don't know how that would look. I don't know how it would look. I'm not here to fix that, but I'm here trying to say, what do I think would be the best, say, happy medium in that? And maybe that is that, because an election at this point, yes, it's a democratic process, and I say Ukraine at the moment cannot claim to be a democracy, maybe a hybrid democracy at best, because elections have not been held. But maybe that is a framework where there could be some level of happy medium between not giving Putin everything that he wants because it would benefit him, still making Trump happy, and somewhat moving the war in a way that America wants peace. I don't know.
Yeah, it's a good call. And you mentioned that people underestimate the power that the U.S. has, but so far we've seen that Trump unleashed this power on Zelensky and Ukraine by, pushing this rare earth minerals deal and stuff like this. But what if he turns makes a U-turn and then tries to pull something similar on Russia and try to, push Russia. Do you think this is a possible scenario? Maybe it's just now it's Ukraine's turn, but then it'll be Russia's turn.
See, this is it's a realistic question and a worry for people, but what it goes against what I think Trump his main concern is. I think Trump's main concern is pushing Russia closer to China. Russia has some major gaps in some of their industrial capacity for protracted attritional war, and so does China. And America, the reason America is such a dominant power is it's so self-sufficient. And some of the pros and cons of Russia and China complement themselves fantastically.
Hmm.
For instance, China has limited amount of ports. It could be potentially naval blockaded in. They're not completely self-sufficient for grain and some other products, and they are behind, as far as we know, on submarine technology, anti-submarine technology, and nuclear propulsion. Now, of those five that I've listed off, Russia is either equal world leader or the world leader in things like nuclear propulsion, submarine technology. Russia is either ahead or equal to the greatest powers on earth in some of those. And as far as food, Russia is a massive exporter, if not the largest exporter of some types of food or food product. And what this does is this backfills all of those problems that China has. It backfills a lot of them, even down to combat experience and training. And of course, I believe if we look back at Mr. President Trump's last administration and his obsession with China, as people will call it, that obsession hasn't just evolved. That is because he has seen the trajectory China is on and them heading into then unipolarity in the future. And one of the ways that that speeds up, or the ability to wage a protracted conflict, even as far as a Cold War conflict, that Russia solves a lot of those issues for China. So what my answer to your original question will be, would he impose those tariffs or sanctions or wanting further mining rights out of Russia? I think the danger in that for Trump, he would be saying is, why would they just not sign a deal somewhere else, even if it is less, but they maintain maybe more control of it? America, Trump, they want to make money. He wants America to be as rich as they can to try and hold off the looming multipolarity crisis that America is going to have with China in a decade or two. Given that the current trajectories, of course, things can change. So if they're, and we've even seen people hint at maybe America may be allowed to have contracts in occupied areas once the border settles. So at this point in time, I think you need to put into your calculation, Trump is looking inwards only. What is best for the American people, what moves forward America, even if my allies, my closest friends who we've fought with may get left behind. And how can we maintain hegemony when we see the rise in the East? So that would be my answer, I guess, very long-winded to that. And of course, Russia is far more self-sufficient than we thought, significantly more self-sufficient than we thought. And of course, significantly more self-sufficient than Ukraine. So as far as at the time speaking. So of course, it's not going to be as easy to lean on Russia, if you're America, as it is onto Ukraine, where you are basically single-handedly, realistically, when we look at the aid that Europe has given compared to America, then funding the war with those massive amounts of ISR and other capabilities that may not be as sexy to present as a tank, but are far more important.
Hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. Well, so far, Russia does not give any signs of walking away from the alliances that have been forged over the past 3 years. I mean, BRICS and it's very cozy relationship with China because Putin has been on the phone with Xi Jinping, and also Lavrov, Russia's foreign minister, went to visit this BRICS meeting down in South Africa. So yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting also how badly Trump wants to separate Russia or move Russia away from China. Will he want to, say, lift some of the sanctions, maybe allow Visa to be back in Russia and stuff like this? Do you see this might happen in the future, like lifting of some of the sanctions on Russia?
Well, I don't see why Russia would sign a deal without that. It's a card on the table for the US, but it's also a card turning away Russia from stopping fighting. At this point in time, objectively on the front line in the areas that matter in attritional and protracted war, as far as industrial capacity, domestic production, manpower, a willingness to fight, which I think is immeasurable. You can't measure it as far as 10 tanks versus 20 tanks. You can't measure willingness to fight. But a lot of the guys I talked to, I spoke to this guy only recently who said, oh, there was a Russian like squad, 3 or 4 guys on motorcycles came up and, we mowed them down with a machine gun. But he said, and what really struck me about that, he said, well, they didn't stand a chance. But he said there was no way there was the motivation in our trench to get on motorbikes like that and storm another trench. And I think as an infantryman, that's what I took away out of that, was the willingness to continue fighting and launch deadly assaults like that too, where there's great risk. In those areas, Russia is objectively winning the attritional war on the ground. In my opinion, it just is by all the metrics, even given some of the Western numbers, which are probably, 20 to 50 to 80% over push. I would still argue that Russia's winning that attritional phase of the war. And what America needs to do, and people may disagree with this, but America at the end of the day needs to give some carrot for Russia to actually stop the fighting. What I say is you've got the carrot or the stick. The stick isn't working, and America, under the Trump administration, is not willing to give Ukraine a big enough fucking stick. So there's going to have to be a carrot. People aren't going to like this, but unless you're willing to give the stick and unless Europe is willing to step up to the plate and go, we are going to do X. It's not $20 billion. If Europe stepped up the plate and we're giving $300 billion, maybe from frozen assets, maybe from somewhere else, or maybe nuclear weapons, maybe then I'd be back in the discussion of the stick. But at this point in time, we are fully on the defensive talking of the carrot. And it is going to have to you're going to have to convince Zelensky to stop fighting. America has a lot of pull there. And you're also going to have to convince Russia to stop fighting also. And there's going to have to be things like sanctions. And the thing is, if you want Russia to come back into an orbit somewhat, you have to give them something that you can take away again. And this is the problem with sanctions and why they can backfire, is if you've taken everything away, what else do you do? New sanctions packages were put in today, I believe the 16th package. And it's against, this company who does dual-use products of X. And I've said that company from day one, they would have known that sanctions were coming for them at some point in time. So either they would have transitioned their business or they will have plans in place to transition. And by every sanctions package, we'll see less and less and less effect. And if America want to be able to ever have economic influence again, it's a push and pull. And it is a very, it's well above your or my pay grade. But I think it comes down to the stick is not working. No one's prepared to give it a big enough stick. So there's going to have to be a carrot. There's going to make a lot of people very, very upset. But it's war, and war is heartbreak and savagery and loss. And the longer war goes on, sadly, in history shows us that war gets more and more savage and brutal. And untamed and unrestricted the longer that war goes on. And this is going to get worse the longer it goes on. There is no ifs or buts about it.
Yeah. It's a lot of what you said actually makes sense. Hey, the last thing I wanted to talk with you about is Europe and its contribution to this conflict. Several European nations, including Britain and France, are considering sending a 30,000 strong force to Ukraine, where they could be stationed in cities and around key infrastructure like nuclear power plants or ports. And France even wants to offer its nuclear shield to Europe. I think it's in today's news. Now, given other recent statements from European leaders about their readiness to send troops to Ukraine to deter Russia, we're essentially talking about a joint European army. Do you believe Europe has the capability to field such a force and supply it without American support? And if this contingent is indeed sent to Ukraine, what impact would it have on the balance of power in the battlefield?
Well, as far as I'm aware, now maybe I've seen different media to you, but all of these that we hear, whether it's from Starmer or Macron or whoever, it all sounds good in the headline of, Britain willing to send 10,000 troops. But you read a little bit down, look at the fine print. And what it will be is after a ceasefire is signed and with America's support. And what annoys me as an Aussie who of course has ties back into the UK is when did the UK lose their balls? I'm like, we're not willing to do shit. The sun never set at one point. We were not willing to do anything without America giving us a fucking pat on the head, a slap on the ass, and run out in the football field. That they're not willing to do anything without that. And what I will say is, at this point in time, the rhetoric coming out of Europe, I put it with very little, very little weight unless it has US backing, which that at this point does not. And if it says with the ceasefire signed, well, then I give it even less. So the balance of power, well, it's going to be after a ceasefire signed. So we can talk about that then of what it may look like. And I'm sure, it will look different. Maybe there'll be a nuclear umbrella, however. But as far as the battlefield right now, tens of thousands of NATO forces or European forces walking across, it's just not going to happen at this point in time. The European rhetoric versus reality, the European paradox has been, I think, one of the most shielded from hate when it should have been brought to the forefront of the rhetoric that some of these leaders have versus what they are willing to give in reality is a kick in the nuts. So these leaders, say a leader from a European state will say, this war is existential for the survival of our state. Without Ukraine winning this war, we will be next. We will not hold up. Everything will collapse. Democracy in Europe will be gone. They will say that. It's existential. But then they're willing to supply things to Ukraine. As we'll send 5 tanks and, 1 HIMARS system. And what I say is, no. If you truly believe this was existential, you'd be going, right, what have we got fucking everywhere, including in storage and this? Send it all, boys. Build factories, do this, do that. So what I say is their rhetoric versus what they're actually doing, it doesn't really fit. And I think there's too much for too long of Europe has been a loudmouth backed by US nuclear umbrella and reliant on really cheap Russian energy. And now that those two have been pulled away, Europe has been caught with its pants down, has gone, holy shit, how do we fix this situation? There's not a superpower among us. We may be a superpower together, but we're not together. Hungary and Slovakia are completely opposed to where France and Germany may sit. And at time of war, when someone's knocking on the door, if there's any cracks, that will form into a chasm instantly. So I even question that. So look, at this point in time, Europe promising to sign forces to go, great, but it's only in the unless I haven't seen it today, but it would be in the fine print as with US support and with the ceasefire in the works or finished. So I find it whatever. It's going to be one of those things. Realistically, a European force is going to end up in Ukraine once the ceasefire is 100%. 100% they're going to end up there. Stabilize the situation, move forces in, justifies having very large militaries. Definitely. But on the other hand, like how much of a change on the battlefield will have, Europe is not prepared, in my belief, and maybe I'll be proven wrong, they are not prepared to send young men into this battle onto the front lines because the idea of how it would look versus how it would actually look, I don't think European states or the Western states are ready for. And I think that as a whole as well about stepping into any future war is I do not believe that the West as a whole is ready to see, and I'll speak from Australian perspective, I do not believe that Australian society, civilians and military is ready to see a drone dropping a bomb on one of our boys who you can recognize their face of. So I believe that needs to come into account too of what you say versus what you're willing to actually do. And if Europe is not willing to send every bit of arms they've got and buy, T-series tanks from whatever country they can find them to send, I think they're a long way from sending their own boys into a war. And the last thing I want is more bloodshed of Europeans, just in general, whether these are from Eurasia, from Russia, from Europe, as Ukraine or the EU or any. It's a horrible, horrible thing. And I think as a society, we are so much better than this. and it's come into a point of maybe no return. It's sunken into an attritional aspect, which, in my opinion, as far as maneuver attritional warfare, and we can speak on that, you do not want to get Russia in an attritional war. Everyone sort of knew this. Of course, if you read anything pre 2022, everything would say do not get a country like Russia, who is an economy backed off stuff, not of speculation. Their economy may be small GDP wise compared to X nation, but that nation may be off speculation and development. This is off just digging shit out of the ground or pumping it out under the sea. That's a very, very difficult country to then have real effect in attritional phase of warfare. Um, and I believe as well, I believe that the Russian command, and I think history has shown this, is more prepared to fight an attritional battle and how it will look than maybe the West is. Now, of course, who would win in a war like that? Well, no one is going to win in a war, if it goes wider. But I think it's important to, I think a lot of people's problem with analysis of the Russian decision to command is putting Western standards onto a non-Western military, of what we may be willing to do or the replacement rate of forces that we can't upkeep as well. So that there's a lot of factors in this, but in my opinion, as soon as the war turned attritional, that was the high water line, because that is a bad way to go. And we may look back in the future and see that Trump didn't betray Ukraine; he was trying to save Ukraine. And that the real ones betraying the population were the ones who at the moment seem like they are upholding it the most, trying to fight back and take back that integrity and sovereignty. Now, I agree with that on the surface. I agree as far as, you and me might have very different opinions on this. That's fine. But I agree from an ethics and morals point of view that, Ukraine should have back to that border. But in a realistic, I go, is the remaining 80% and the population worth losing potentially for that 20%? And I think some of these leaders in the West who are willing just to pour and pour and pour into what I see as a battle of men, not a battle of money or weapons anymore, I think is something that future may look back very, very unkindly too. And there was a quote the other day of a battlefield where victory is impossible is not a fight. It's a graveyard of the betrayed. So I guess we will see. Maybe Trump is the enemy. Maybe Trump is making the hard decisions that no one else actually has the balls to make.
Mhm. Yeah, sure. Well, things are moving fast, and I'd really love to see, this whole conflict, coming to a concluding point somewhat in the near future. That would be actually really great, and I'm sure a lot of people um, you know, would look forward to this. Absolutely.
Well, of course, that's had a huge effect on Russia. Russia's lost a massive amount of men, and even a more huge amount that are wounded. And then after the war, we'll see even a larger amount with scars too. So, whether people are looking at this as a
Hey,
scar.
uh-huh. Yeah, you were back. It's just you broke up for a second or
Oh,
two.
sorry.
Uh-huh.
I said what I was saying, it was the amount of
Hey, Matthew, are you there? Can you hear me? I think I lost you.
oh no. When
Oh no,
did I
you're
cut?
back again. It's just it's this back and forth.
No, you're right.
Yeah. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And yeah, I'm really curious to see how this one goes. And yeah, like I said, things are like moving so swiftly. It's just crazy. Like a week ago, I thought of something else. Now we're talking about something, completely different. And it just each stage just brings more news and more stuff. And yeah, just
Hmm,
really curious to see how this one go. All right, I'm gonna stop recording now.
perfect.